Hello, my name's Colin Crithers, and I'm a student reporter and broadcaster at the University of Iowa. As a journalist, my job is to tell stories, while also balancing everything else going on in my life as a student. But no one tells our stories. So, my goal is to tell the stories of the student journalists, broadcasters, and storytellers all across the country. Let's walk the student beat.
Welcome in. Today we are walking the student beat with Mihir. Mihir, how's it going?
I'm doing great, Colin. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, absolutely. So first, just want you to give a quick introduction of yourself and a few of the journalistic outlets you've worked with.
Yeah, for sure. So my name's Mihir Sinhasan. I'm a member of the class of 2026 of the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University. So in other words, next school year, I'll be a senior. In terms of what I've done, it's a lot of stuff, especially with play-by-play broadcasting, which I do for Blaze Radio, which is ASU student radio station, along with Inferno TV, which we do some different games for both high schools in the Valley, along with some different club sports, mainly Arizona State Women's Club Hockey, along with some play-by-play, but also some sideline work for Phoenix Rising's radio network, which is a local soccer team in town. I also do some writing as well with Inferno Intel, another student club, along with CBB Review, where I work as Arizona State men's basketball's beat reporter. And then I've also done some work as a TV and sports broadcast journalist, if you will. I did it twice, had a couple of stints with Arizona PBS and Cronkite News, one covering the 2024 Summer Olympics on site in Paris, and then one this past semester in Phoenix. And then I also work as a podcast host for Ohio Volley Talk, which runs every spring. And then I also work as a radio and broadcaster and producer for the Varsity Sports Show, also based in Phoenix. That's my internship for this summer. So it's a lot of stuff, but it's a lot of fun too.
Yeah, you got a lot going on. I want to dive into some of those things, but first, let's talk about your journey into the journalism world. I want to first ask, how did you get into it? What was your inspiration? What got you your start?
I think the start for me was just watching football games in general. I think I was in first grade or second grade when I really started watching games, and I enjoyed the idea of commentary, right? The play-by-play guy and the analyst in stadium, and then the studio crew either in New York or LA, and then sometimes for big games they'd be on site. And oftentimes I would try to mimic them in ways. So I'm a Bengals fan. I'm from Cincinnati. So oftentimes when I'm watching the Bengals game, it's like first down and 10. Dalton in the gun, takes a snap, throws to the end zone, caught by Green, touchdown Bengals, or something like that, where I'd be kind of, commentating and trying to mimic the play-by-play guys. So I kind of enjoyed doing that. My parents, not so much when we would watch some games together. So I was a little bit shy and, reel back over time. But then I started doing it for real my freshman year of high school. When I was at San Xavier High School in Cincinnati, I was part of their broadcasting club, ESPX. So I really enjoyed doing that my freshman year. And that's when I kind of thought to myself, maybe I could do this in college. Maybe I could do this for a career. Got laughed at immediately because I was a shy person at heart. So it was kind of tough for me to, get out of my comfort zone. That was me getting out of my comfort zone at the time. So it took a lot of convincing. The first 3 years, I would say, was a battle of just convincing myself, but also my parents that I could belong in this industry. I could belong in doing journalism in general. So I really started to take it seriously, I'd say, the fall of my junior year. That was when COVID was really at its peak. So everybody was watching the games online. Not too many people were in the stadium watching it. So oftentimes, even for a soccer broadcast, which I was on the soccer team, for St. X that year, we would get views of up to 800 to 1,000. And then I remember that team went to the state semifinals, and we were on the call for that game. A lot of people were tuning in, upwards of 3,000 total views for a soccer game, even though it was a state semifinals. It was really, really impressive. And I remember thinking at the end of that season, wow, this is pretty good. I could do this for a living. And now it was really pertinent. Like I wanted to do this more than I wanted to do something in STEM, which was something that I really thought about from when I was in third grade until eighth grade. Something from like an environmental scientist to a math teacher to a statistician, something in that field. But all of a sudden, I wanted to do something in broadcasting and then eventually journalism. So eventually my parents kind of caught on and they, said, all right, you can go ahead and do it. You're good at your job. We know that you're good at your job. You can go ahead and do it. So that was kind of my story. And then eventually, in terms of when I got into journalism, it was when I went to Arizona State, majoring in sports journalism, as is the case right now. So that's when I really started to, think in a journalistic way. Because yes, broadcasting is true, and broadcasting is a form of journalism, but in terms of like the roots of journalism, that's when I truly started to work at it. But that's the long and, winding story of how I eventually got to where I am today.
Absolutely. And you mentioned junior year kind of being the flip for you, but was there something specific that helped you like switch with your concentration and focus?
I think in terms of my concentration, it was just constantly calling games because the one thing with that junior year, I don't know if it was because of interest or because of COVID, we had a certain set of broadcast crews for each game. So the football team had one broadcast crew. The soccer team had one broadcast crew. So it was CJ Saz and I. We were broadcasting every game at home that year. So oftentimes I would go to the stadium and that would be my one time where I could really broadcast a game and spread my wings, if you will. And then more importantly than that, I think it was the playoff run because the team went to the state semifinals. I was able to call games every 3 to 4 days. And that was the same thing my senior year when I was once again on the soccer broadcasting crew, but this time we were able to go on the road. So once again, we were broadcasting games every 3 to 4 days. So just that constant idea of being in a booth, constant idea of growing, I think made me more comfortable on air and made me switch in ways.
Absolutely. Reps are always really important. And since you were doing this in high school, I think you had a good idea of where you may have wanted to go, but what drew you in to go to Arizona State specifically?
I think going into my senior year, and this is just how I think as a person, not just as a broadcaster, I want to go to the best school that will give me the best education. That's simply what I was thinking about. As long as I was fitting everything from a broadcasting perspective, from an academic perspective with my SATs and ACTs, I wanted to go to a school that would give me that biggest chance, that biggest opportunity. So I applied to, I'd say, I don't know the exact number, but about 10 to 15 schools out of high school. And a lot of them were, those elite programs that a lot of people talk about, like the Syracuse, Florida, Ohio, Arizona State. And that was essentially my top four as soon as I whittled down the options that were available at the time. It was Syracuse, Arizona State, Ohio, and Florida. Now, Arizona State was the first school that actually accepted me back in November. And then Florida, I heard back from in March, and then Ohio was sometime in January. Now, Ohio was kind of interesting, but I kind of sort of like the campus, but I also wanted a school that would kind of complement my academic rigor that I was used to at St. X. I wanted a place where I could be challenged in the classroom, so I didn't really like Ohio because of that. So in reality, it was a top three: Syracuse, Arizona State, and Florida. And Arizona State really had a good option because I was also accepted into Barrett the Honors College. So Florida had a chance, but when I heard back from Florida, they essentially said, we didn't waitlist a bunch of people, but they basically said, we admitted more people than we can fit on campus. So your first year is going to be entirely online. I didn't really like that because you have to remember we were just coming off of COVID, and I didn't like that idea of online education. I wanted to be in person, especially since that 2020, 2021 year, my junior year, I spent most of the year online. It was by choice, but at the end, I just wasn't feeling it and I went back in person. So I didn't like Florida. It was really between Arizona State and Syracuse. Syracuse was my number one. I heard back from them in April. You're going to like this story. So I was calling a game. It was St. X volleyball against Moeller. I get the email. I think I get it at St. X. Then I drive from St. X to Moeller to call the game. And I say to myself, I got to open this in the booth. How poetic would it be for me to go to this school that I only thought about because of my interest in broadcasting and in journalism and get the acceptance letter in the stadium, in the arena. So I open up my phone, I pull out the email, and I'm thinking, this is the moment. I get waitlisted. And at the moment, I was a little bit crushed because that was the number one, right? It's essentially the Harvard of broadcast journalism, and it crushed me. And then I had to remember, oh shoot, I'm calling a game in half an hour. So you have to make that mental switch in your head. But I think I remember in that moment, as I was calling those games, I was settling into the idea of Arizona State. And I toured Syracuse the summer before my senior year. As I said before, I toured Ohio, and that too in October. Those were the only two schools I toured because I was that confident that Syracuse was going to be the one. So either way, accepted Arizona State. I said, all right, I'll enjoy some summer weather. It will be hot, but at least winters will be nice. And, I went out there in a few weeks before I actually moved in. It was around 4th of July, toured the school, kind of walked around. And I've figured to myself, this is where I want to be. And I think the moment where I realized that, even though I had already accepted, was my dad and I were staying at a hotel a block away from the actual campus. We walked maybe a block north. To my right is the dorm building, what was known as Taylor Place, now known as Gordon Commons. To my left was the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. And at that moment, I realized this is going to be home for a while. And I think that's when it really settled in that moment that I was going to Arizona State and I was living in Arizona.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, an amazing story right there. Settling in, finding home, but also you got to give some love to St. X. I went to Elder High School, and for those listening that do not know, we are rival high schools, but St. X does have probably, I would say, at least in the GCL, most of all Ohio, one of the best academic systems in the state of Ohio. It's very impressive. So I understand that with Arizona State and everything. Well, we might bash heads a little bit with that a little bit later on, but you're just like me at Arizona State. You do a lot of reporting and you do a lot of broadcasting. I think maybe like me as well, you lean towards the broadcast side, but how do those intertwine for you? How do you learn from each and incorporate them in all of your jobs?
That's a good question. And I think the biggest thing in that regards is why I'm doing all these things, right? Because the idea of any college, but we'll say Cronkite specifically, is that you want to get your foot in the door. And for me, the only type of experience I had was in play-by-play. I had never operated a camera. I had never written an article, a gamer sidebar, anything of that matter. So I went into the first ever student radio station meeting with Blaze Radio, and they were talking about the different play-by-play opportunities. The problem was you don't get too much. You maybe get 1 to 2 calls per season, and that's pretty much it. So I would probably say by the time I got to that second semester of my freshman year, I thought to myself, I need to do more than play by play. I need to do something, not just to better myself, but two, so I'm not bored and I'm just scrolling social media in my dorm room for a good chunk of the weekend. I need to do something to keep myself active because we talked about the academic rigor of St. X, not really the case at Arizona State. Yes, there are classes, but it's not as tough. You can complete homework on time, at least for myself. So it made things a little bit easier in ways. So I think that's why I got involved with reporting, first writing, and then videography. I think the biggest thing for me that intertwines all of those things is the idea to be concise and the idea to be intentional when you're on a call or when you're writing or when you're doing videography or making a sort of script. You have to be intentional with your words. You have to understand how you're, creating a story in ways. So sometimes I like to economize and just not say too many words, let the moment speak for itself, especially when I'm doing play by play and trying to relate it to the different packages that I do. Because it's the same way. You can tell a story in a few amount of words. So that's the one thing I relate with those two. With writing, the one thing I do with writing is that I find a different way to address something. So, for example, Arizona State football, you can also refer to them as ASU, the Sun Devils, Kenny Dillingham's side. And that's the type of vernacular and language I like to use when I'm on play by play. So I can talk about, say, first down and 10 and Kenny Dillingham's side, once again, moving down the field. It's just itty bitty things like that. So I'm just not repeating myself. And I can, once again, mix it up, spice it up, and make it more interesting for the viewer.
Yeah, and you bring up Dillingham there. I got to imagine how cool was it to win the first round of the college football playoffs? And what was your work involved with that, getting past that first round there?
Yeah, I mean, it was such an interesting matchup overall because we didn't expect anything into this past season because this team had back-to-back 3-9 seasons. And even though Kenny Dillingham had a lot of promises, we were still skeptical. We were thinking, okay, maybe this team becomes bowl eligible. We don't know what's going to happen. But I think by the time we got to week 3, the team was 3-0, and we were thinking, okay, maybe they make a bowl. It's probably going to be like the Surf Pro Responders Bowl or something, nothing major. But at that point, we were just thinking, okay, maybe it's just enough. So I will say this though. So I did a lot of stuff with Arizona State football because I was able to do some recaps with both Inferno Intel and Blaze Radio. I also did a couple of Arizona State's football calls in remotely, which is essentially, if you will, the JV broadcasting of the varsity broadcasting, which is calling games in person, which I'll do to some extent this upcoming season. But I was able to see essentially what was the growth of that team. And I think if there's one moment, and Kenny Dillingham would probably agree with me, it was October 5th. I believe it was week, I want to say 5 or 6 against Kansas. It was family weekend, really hot, about 105 degrees for kickoff. The first Big 12 home game at Arizona State. I was on the sideline for that. I was sideline reporting for Blaze Radio. It was a really good experience. And as the game is going along, it's just back and forth, right? Because this is a Kansas team that, yes, was 1-3 or 1-4 going into that game, but didn't really have, anything else. I mean, yes, they did have a 1-4 record, but they still looked pretty good at the time, and they were still able to become bowl eligible or at least close to bowl eligible at the end of the year. So that team had a lot. So it was a back and forth game. And I remember there was one moment that Sam Levitt connected with Jordan Tyson for a touchdown. This was in the fourth quarter. And I did a hit because I was reviewing all of the media tapes from the earlier week. And Sam Levitt told the media that he likes to find connections with his receivers in the moment. Yes, he can build it off the field or in training, but anything that happens in game really sticks well with him. So I said a hit similar to that right when Arizona State made it 28-24. And then Kansas went down the field and scored. And then I remember Arizona State responded back. It was a 2-minute drill. They're able to find the end zone. Once again, it was Levitt to Tyson. And I remember texting the crew that was upstairs, what did I tell you about connections? And that I think was the one moment in my eyes where I thought, okay, this team could be something. And then the next week, they beat Utah at the time ranked, and it was really electric. Again, Kenny Dillingham has that interview where he's jumping around with the crowd as Quinn Kessenich, I believe, was interviewing him. Just really surreal scenes. And I think that was also important too. I was doing videography for that game. So I saw the emotion, the field rush, everything. So overall, it was a really interesting season. And I think it shows the idea of belief that can happen within a team and within a community as well. Because you have to understand that at the time, Arizona sports was, not much. The Suns were coming off another disappointing season in the playoffs. The Cardinals, they were doing all right, but didn't make the playoffs again. You have the Arizona Coyotes, or what was the Arizona Coyotes, and then they left. That team basically gave a lot of joy to the Valley. And I think the idea was just building over time, right? We said, okay, they're 3-0. Let's see how they do in Big 12 play. They did great in Big 12 play. All right, let's see if they can win the Big 12 championship. They did exactly that. And just being there every step of the way just made me sink in how great this team was. And also being in those moments were incredibly great as well, including that early run where I did some remote coverage there, both in terms of writing, but also broadcasting. I was remote calling the Big 12 championship when they beat Iowa State in Arlington. I was doing a pregame, halftime, postgame for the Peach Bowl, which they lost to Texas. So, I mean, being there every step of the way, I think made me realize, one, how grateful I am, but two, how grateful I am to be a part of a team like that. Because so many people have come before us at Arizona State and they've covered those 2022, 2023 teams where they were 3-9 and they just never saw a team that got to the level that this team did. And I think just the idea of getting there gave a lot of joy to everybody who was there, from students to media people. And I think everybody in the Valley really, really enjoyed that season. And now that Levitt and Tyson are returning, even though Scadaboo's gone, everybody wants to come to the Valley and be a part of what Kenny Dillingham is building. And I think that's the greatest thing about it because this is a team that can now grow on. I mean, the expectation is that they are a Big 12 contender, and the goal is every year to make the college football playoff. And even though things have changed now, where now ideally they probably make the first round rather than get a bye and all of a sudden they're in the Peach Bowl, it's just such a great experience to be a part of, from everybody involved. And I think you take a look at Kenny Dillingham's phrase, activate the valley. And I think it spoke to everybody in that stadium, everybody in terms of the team, everybody covering it. I think everybody was activated by that season.
Absolutely. I mean, that was probably was the most special, most spectacular season in all of college football this last year. I think you can make a strong argument for that. I also have to be very thankful for that Big 12 championship game because Arizona State beat Iowa State. And as unbiased as I'm supposed to be at times, it's always nice when I see Iowa State lose. But you did bring up the fact of like calling games remotely or sending a text as a sideline reporter. I think from a fan's perspective, you don't always see what goes on behind the scenes. And I think this is a special part of student broadcasting, student reporting, is there's so much more that goes into it that most people don't see. So when you mention those jobs and someone was to go and watch some of your work or read an article that you wrote, what's some things that they might not see that happens behind the scenes?
I think the thing for me, in terms of writing articles, it's just the process of it, right? I don't think many people see it because for a lot of people, they show up to the game, maybe they show up a little bit early, like half an hour to an hour before, they enjoy the pregame festivities, they watch the game, they enjoy the game. In the case of Arizona State, maybe you rush the field and then you leave, right? That's how you enjoy a game. That's how a lot of us enjoy games when you watch it in the stadium. I think from a writing perspective, it's a much longer day because you get there about maybe 2 to 3 hours before and you're setting up all your stuff. You're thinking about what you want to write about. You're on the field pregame, watching the different warm-ups, watching the different players, seeing how they're doing and getting ready for the games. If you're videography, you're setting up your camera, making sure you find a spot too, because you have to get there 2 to 3 hours before because there's so little space in the media room. And either way, you're just trying to enjoy the action, trying to take notes mentally or on your phone or take a notepad out. And then you have to rush upstairs if you're doing writing to the press box and actually watch the game. And I think that obviously is the biggest thing. You're taking in a lot of notes. The other thing, too, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but the idea of walking down from the press box to the field while the game is going on in the fourth quarter. This is something that's only done with football, mainly if it's done at a football stadium. Other big sports like basketball, you're basically in your seat until the game's done. But with football, you're up there, and then with about 5 to 6 minutes left to go in the fourth quarter, you're taking elevators down to field level where you're going to be on the field for the rest of the game and just enjoying the action there because writers are involved. And then from there, you go from the field to the media room for press conferences because they do press conferences really, really quick. So it's not like you can go from your chair upstairs down towards the media room once the game gets done. Just impossible. So that's another interesting part because it's an interesting rush to get to the field. I think the biggest one for me was the BYU game where, there's two top 25 teams and BYU was driving at that point. If they get a touchdown, they take the lead, their first lead of the day. It was a very interesting situation because everybody's trying to rush to the elevator, try to get down. As soon as you land at field level, I think everybody's making a beeline towards the entrance to the field because you want to see the final play that's happening, which ended up being an Arizona State interception with Javen Robinson and then everything else that unfolded during that game with the two field rushes but you get to be a part of the action. You get to be in the midst of it as well. And sometimes you have to like channel that energy in that moment to, try to get the best chance or try to get, the key plays, if you will, so you can add that to your article because you don't want to miss anything. Yes, there's replay, but there's something important and something beautiful about seeing it with your own eyes. And then the most important part, the press conferences, right? Press conferences happen after you're done, you head upstairs, finish your article, and then you leave it about 2 hours or so afterwards. I usually set a timer for myself. This is not just for football, but any sport that I'm covering. I usually take a look at whenever I send my final tweet of the final score give or take a few minutes or so, and then I give myself 2 hours. So let's say the game ends at 4:17. I say, all right, cut off for the article. I need to get it done by 6:15. Either way, by the time I walk out of the office or the press box or wherever, there's nobody around because everybody else has left. It's just a barren landscape. I kind of like that. I like when things are peaceful, so it kind of puts a nice bow on the day, but it also means when you're covering something late at night, you're not leaving the stadium or the arena until it's like 11 p.m., 12 a.m., or, into the next day. So I think it's a lot more work than people imagine, but it's also a lot of great work too.
Absolutely. I remember one game I went out to Maryland for a football game between Iowa and Maryland, and yeah, there was three of us there, a photographer, a writer, then I was there as a videographer, reporter. And we were the last three in there. And it was kind of cool because they kind of left the whole stadium to us for a minute because we started to walk around after we finished our work. And then the only issue was we were locked in for a little bit. So we had to find a certain way out. I don't remember how, but I think we went through a certain concession stand or bathroom and found a back door that was left unlocked. It was a whole thing pretty much. But you also mentioned working with Phoenix Rising FC of the USL. So tell me exactly what you're doing with them and how you landed that.
Yeah, so I work with them, I like to say as a radio broadcaster. I work with their network. I mainly do some sideline reporting, but I also do some analysis and play-by-play, and I might be doing more of those types of things as the season goes along. But I basically landed that because it's another student led club, or not really a led club, but a led organization. So at the time, the guy who was running it, Ryan Sikora, he hit me up. He said, I got an offer for you. You're probably going to take it, but I want to talk to you about it. So I said, okay. Calls me up, tells me about Rising Radio. And I said to myself, absolutely. I would absolutely take it. And he said, for the first year, you're probably going to be doing a lot of producing, a lot of behind the scenes work. Are you sure you want to take it? I said, absolutely. Because you have to remember, from my perspective, one of the first things that introduced me to Cronkite was Rising Radio. I would watch Ryan and then his co-commentator at the time, Peyton Gallagher, call games on the radio because at the time, Rising Radio was run by Blaze Radio, ASU's student radio station. So it was very much a student-led program, still is a student-led program in ways. So either way, I wanted to be there. And then I got the opportunity early on to do sideline because another sideline reporter, or a guy who was going to be a sideline reporter, backed out. So I started doing a lot of sideline reporting last year, and then that worked into a little bit of analysis, called a couple of games as play-by-play. Now it's a little bit more this year, but it's still a very interesting experience because for me, that was my first taste of doing something outside of Cronkite. And I think everybody at Cronkite strives to get to that point where they're not doing stuff for ASU or around ASU. They want to do something for someone else, right? And I think for me, that was the first moment because you can still say that I was doing something professional, right? When I was on the call for one game, it was Phoenix Rising against Memphis 901. That was another remote call because the game was on the road. But I remember thinking to myself, this is in ways, my professional play-by-play debut. So again, grateful for Ryan Sikora who put me on it. Grateful for Kevin Cardez who is running it now. He and could be sharing play-by-play duties. Ryan just graduated, but he's still in town, so he'll still be the lead play-by-play until he leaves, and then Kevin and I will split for the rest of the season. But either way, it's one of my favorite experiences because you get to do something outside of Arizona State, and you get to help out a lot of people because a lot of people care about Phoenix Rising. When I came on last year, the team was fresh off winning the USL championship. So there were a lot of expectations riding high for them. The fans were, again, expecting a really good season, even though they did make the playoffs, but they kind of middled their way in as an eighth seed. So it wasn't necessarily a good season overall, but they still did pretty well. And again, they're doing well right now, knock on wood. They got a 4-game win streak. If you count the win against New Mexico United this past weekend, the Jägermeister Cup on penalty kicks. But either way, just a really good experience and something that I really cherish too, because I want to work in soccer. That was something that I set out to do when I came to Phoenix. I really liked doing it when I was in Ohio because soccer is one of my favorite sports. So just being a part of that is just amazing in general.
No, that's a really cool opportunity. You mentioned that it's mostly student led. Is that mostly Arizona State students, or is that a mix from some other schools?
It's mostly Arizona State. So that's how it was essentially started. So I believe the story was one guy at Arizona State wanted to cover Phoenix Rising for Blaze Radio, the student radio station. And then the sports director at the time, Peyton Gallagher, was like, well, I didn't sign off on this, but apparently they're giving us a pretty good opportunity. So why don't we call games for them? Because they don't have a radio network. So we ended up doing that. And then there's also a Spanish radio network where some more Cronkite students help out with that. So it's a really good experience for everybody involved.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the high school start there. I want to go back a little bit at this point. Obviously, what's really important there is the reps, but now still doing broadcasting at in college. What do you think was most beneficial at St. X and what helped you the most? What prepared you the most for now?
I think the biggest thing with St. X, and this is not just from a professional perspective, but a personal perspective, is the mentality. Because when I was at St. X, I was averaging 5 to 6 hours of sleep a night during the weekdays. Weekend would be for catching up on sleep. But when I was at St. X, I had work that needed to be done. So I pushed myself to do that work, to learn, find the love of learning at St. X. That was another thing too, is that I liked what I did at St. X from an academic perspective, even though I was involved with journalism and play-by-play and different clubs overall. So I think the one thing I liked about St. X is it made me think in a good mentality. And that really helped me out once I was in my freshman year and sophomore year at Arizona State. I'd say more then than is the case now, because then I really wasn't getting too many opportunities. So I said to myself, I got to create it my own way. So I started doing some remote calls on my YouTube page while the World Cup was going on. And then again, I didn't really like what I was doing because nobody was tuning in, but a lot of other people, such as Ryan Sikora, said, "Hey, I kind of like that. I mean, you're showing that you care about being here at Cronkite and you care about being in this industry." So it was like, that's pretty cool. So I said, why not do it at the Women's World Cup? Now, the Women's World Cup a couple of years ago was in Australia and New Zealand. Most of the games were at like, from a Arizona time perspective, 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. in the morning. For me, that included either staying up until, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., or 3 a.m., or just going to bed at like 10 a.m., sleeping for a couple of hours, getting up, calling the game, finish it around 5 a.m., 6 a.m. or so, and then go back to bed. And that was the type of mentality I needed because I don't think I would have done that at the start of my career. I would have said, I enjoy my sleep, I enjoy my time and what I'm doing. I don't need to get better because I'm complacent where I am now. At that time, I didn't care. I wanted to get those reps because I wanted to get better in the moment. And more importantly, I didn't want to get a little lackluster when I started the school year because everybody else was out at summer ball or doing some sort of internship that I wasn't doing. So I wanted to keep my feet ready and just be ready for the moment overall. And I think that helped me catapult what ended up being a really good sophomore year for me because I was just working from covering stuff to doing play-by-play, even behind the scenes, right? I wanted to do something sports journalism related at least once a week if it meant, writing something or doing play-by-play. And I think when I look at my calendar from that past year, it ended up being, I'd say on average, 2 to 3 per week or whatever. I mean, that was, pretty impressive from my standpoint. I don't reach those numbers right now, I'll say, but now I get a chance where I can pick and choose what I can do because of the different opportunities that I get. So it was very interesting because I don't get to that position if I don't go to St. X because St. X made me work. St. X made me create a work ethic and care about what's the biggest thing I can do from an education standpoint. Back then, it was, doing my homework and in all the different subjects, math, English, religion, social studies, you name it. Now it's about bettering my career. So anything journalism related, I want to do. And I still have that mentality of trying to get the next gig or try to get that next level overall. So I want to try to push myself to make sure that I am working on the weekends. I've continued to tell myself the weekends are for me getting better. So are the weekdays as well. I think the other thing about that year. I think it was 2024. And I thought about this for a while. I called or covered a game every Saturday from January until June. Only twice I missed it. I did not do anything on a Saturday. One was on March 16th because I was supposed to call a club baseball game for ASU, but apparently something got lost in the sauce where we showed up at the wrong park, or the baseball team just never showed up in general, or they canceled a game. So we ended up just going back to Phoenix that day because we had to take a 1 hour drive out to Casa Grande to call that. And we said, all right, well, we're not going to wait out here. Let's just go back. The other one was when I was calling the game for Phoenix Rising, and it was on a Friday. So I ended up having my Saturday off. That was it. That was it during the entire time. I was just consistently working. And I don't get to that spot if it's not for Saint X because I want to do everything to just better myself. Even when it means, paying money to go on different trips or going to different spots or trying new experiences. I just want to get better, simply put.
Absolutely. That's willpower right there. That's a lot you've done. And you are still pretty connected with some Cincinnati high school sports as you talked about Ohio Volleyball Talk. So, first, just let us know what that is and what you do with them.
Yeah, so Ohio Volley Talk is a podcast that I have with Elliot Scully, and we get to cover boys high school volleyball in the entire state of Ohio. So I talked about my time calling soccer at St. X. I also was the voice of the volleyball team as well, and that was, I think, essentially the solidifier that, made me realize, okay, I could do this for good in this industry, and I think it was the same with my parents as well. Shout out to my dad who would watch almost every game that I'd be on the call for. It still is the case today. But either way, I was very involved with boys volleyball in the state of Ohio before I left for Arizona. And then that October of 2022, Elliot Scully, who I knew for a while, he was a player at Thomas Worthington. He had also recently graduated and was at Alabama doing his undergrad there. He hit me up and said, "Hey, I got this idea for a podcast. It's basically covering the teams that we grew up with during our time in high school." And I said, "I'd love it." Because at the time, I really didn't have anything going for me at Cronkite in terms of any sort of stability when it came to the reps I was getting. So I said, why not? So every week we get to interview a different coach or a different player or someone of interest in the world of volleyball. Most of the time, it tends to be a head coach, but we've branched out to former players, former coaches, and some different things as well. We talked to a broadcaster, talked to the official administrator of boys volleyball in the state of Ohio, Emily Mason. That was a really good episode we did last year. And then the rest of the time is just talking about the different games that have gone on in terms of analysis, different predictions. We do rankings every week during the regular season, just get our thoughts on how the teams are doing overall. And I think a lot of people really like it. The coaches love it, the players love it as well. We've gone from, I think it was around 100 followers on Instagram before that first episode back in 2023. We just are getting close to wrapping up our third season, and we've got almost 1,400 followers on Instagram and got over 300 followers on Twitter. So people really care about the work that we do. And as we go on towards the playoffs and into the state tournament, we come back, obviously. I mean, the first season, since I was still living in Cincinnati, I went back on site and I was still enjoying some of the games as the playoffs started. I was doing some coverage on the different social media platforms. And then Elliot and I met up at state and we kind of combined forces and did a lot of stuff there to really, promote the sport of volleyball, but more importantly, promote the teams that are in the state tournament. And that's something that I continue to do, even though I live in Phoenix full time. I've lived in Phoenix full time since July of 2023. That's something that I do every year. I fly back to Ohio and enjoy the state tournament and just continue to do my coverage on site. We also do an analysis episode after the semifinals and then going into the finals the next day. And then we wrap up the year talking with the state champs in both Division One and Division Two, which we're actually doing this week on our podcast as we wrap up the season ourselves. So it's a very interesting idea, and it's a very interesting season as well. I think we've wanted to extend it for a full year, but both of us are just way too busy to, find the time and find guests and find something to talk about. So we just tend to keep it as, like a 3 month stint, and we really lock in during that time, and then we go our separate ways. But it gives me that one connection back to Ohio, and I really like the idea of going back to Ohio, whether it be Cincinnati, but Springfield, where the championships are, and just connecting with a lot of people. Because I think that's the one thing I've really liked about that podcast. Because when we started, people relatively knew who we were, and they were like, "All right, thanks for having us on." Now, when we talk to people, most of the guests we have on continue to say, "Hey, thanks for having me on. Thanks for all you do for the growth of boys volleyball. This is a relatively undercovered sport compared to the other sports out there at the high school level. We really appreciate what you do." And that's one thing that I'm really grateful for, because that's the one thing that's been consistent for me. I've gotten better in terms of who I work for, right? We talked about, me just doing stuff with ASU to doing stuff with Phoenix Rising, CVB Review, and some other different organizations outside of Cronkite that give me a better opportunity in ways. Ohio Volley Talk's the one thing that's remained the same. And I think that's the one thing that I enjoy a lot, because it connects me to home. It connects me to my roots in Ohio. Even though I don't live there anymore, it's still really special to go back there.
Absolutely. And I think, and you mentioned the people saying it, but also just the growth of the followers alone is just a small, even just a small illustration of the growth of boys volleyball specifically in Ohio. So not only have you guys been a huge part of that, obviously, because when I started getting more into boys high school volleyball, covering that with the Elder News Network, I saw your guys' page a lot, but you guys also cover that a little bit. So what's it like noticing that you've been a part of that growth, but also seeing that sport grow as much as it has the past few years?
I think in general, it's just a growing sport overall. That's something you see in Ohio, but also a lot of places, right? When I was in high school, for most of the time you were in high school, boys volleyball was not a sanctioned sport under OHSAA. That changed in 2023 because of the interest that's growing not just in Cincinnati, which it has been for a long time, but across the entire state. And I think a lot of people are really starting to get hooked on boys volleyball and understand the ideas behind it, the sport in general, because we've talked about girls volleyball for the longest time. Women's volleyball is very popular. Not too many people have talked about the men's side of it. And I think that's one thing that's really changing, because it's as exciting, if not more exciting, than women's volleyball. So I think it's a really interesting sport. And I'd say I'm very grateful to be a part of the growth overall, because you get to bring a lot of people that may not be interested in volleyball or may not be interested in the broadcast side of it, and really try to combine those two forces. And that was one thing that, Elliot and I discussed a little bit earlier, was that that's the one thing that really makes us a good team, because he brings that volleyball background himself, playing the sport for years. I bring that broadcasting background that I've done for years. We mesh it together and it works really well. And we put out a product that a lot of people can find relatable and a lot of people can enjoy overall.
Absolutely. And I have to throw this part in there. When you were the voice of St. X volleyball, or even just back in high school seeing some games, how much did you love those St. X Elder matchups out there?
Oh man, it was crazy. I still remember one of the best games that I called, or at least one of the best games that I was a part of, was St. X Elder in 2022. That year, Elder was arguably or unarguably the best team in the state, right? That team was state or bust. They ended up making the final, and then they got upset there to our rivals, Moeller. But that was a very interesting game, because Elder was expected to come in and just take it to St. X. And that's what they did to some extent. But they had a lot of missed serves, a lot of errors in that game, Elder. And then St. X was just able to weather that storm, and they were able to pull off that win in 5 sets at home. And a lot of people were just really happy. I remember that call where, it was a setter's dump, I believe, by Mike Harmeyer. As soon as that ball lands, I'm breaking the mic. My color commentator, Anthony France, is breaking the mic. The volleyball team's rushing on the court. It's absolutely pandemonium at that moment. And it was just incredible to see. But those St. X games, just the GCL in general, it's really good because for the longest time, Cincinnati was light years ahead of the rest of the state. That's the reason why before OHSAA took over, they would actually send two teams from each region to the state tournament in Division One because that region was just so stacked. So, I mean, whenever St. X and Elder and really the GCL in general shows up on a volleyball court, it's always electric.
Yeah, GCL sports are always so much fun. We did mention how St. X has a great curriculum, but also their athletic programs overall are stellar. So we've continued to keep going, but now let's take a quick little water break. I want to ask, when someone asks for a good story out of you, or maybe a funny story from your time at Arizona State, whether it's student radio or reporting or broadcasting, is there something that comes to mind to you immediately?
I think in terms of funny stories, I could tell a lot, but I think personally for me, I think it goes back to last year and it goes back to ASU's football season as well. So ASU was playing Cincinnati at Nippert Stadium. I decided to go back there because I said to myself, hey, I haven't been back to Cincinnati since I moved. It would be a great homecoming for myself. So I go there, do all the coverage. I also meet up with some friends because I was in town. I flew into town the morning of, or not the morning of, the morning before the game. So I had basically like a whole day to do my preview, but also hang out with them before, covering the game on Saturday for Inferno Intel. Then the game happens, do all my usual stuff. ASU ended up losing 24 to 14. The last loss they had before they lost to the Peach Bowl against Texas. And then, of course, Kenny Dillingham goes into the press conference. He's talking about our kicker at the time, or the kicker at the time, Ian Hershey, and saying, hey, this guy, we need to find a new kicker, right? If you are interested in kicking and you're a student at Arizona State, email me. We're having kicking tryouts on Monday. And someone asked, are you serious about this? He said, yeah, I'm serious. That's just the tip of the iceberg with the story. Either way, we talked about it before, the idea of going back to the press box or the booth and writing the story. For that trip, I did not have to do that because I had to catch an Uber back to CVG, Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky International Airport, to catch a flight back to Phoenix. Now, my flight going back was going from Cincinnati to Chicago O'Hare and then from there to Phoenix. Well, my flight from Cincinnati to Chicago was delayed because of a maintenance failure. So basically, I couldn't really go back to Phoenix that night. So I'm scrolling on the United app. I'm trying to find some sort of flight that works for me because the next day in Phoenix, I have to call a game on ESPN Plus. It's Arizona State soccer against Kansas. That's at 1 o'clock Arizona time. So I'm thinking, please, I gotta find something really early in the morning. Luckily, I get something and it's like at 5:15 to Denver, and then I find another flight from Denver to Phoenix. I'm able to make it in time. The craziest part about that is when I land in Chicago and I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, I can't, do anything here, if you will, until 5:15 when I leave for Denver. I got to write my article. So I wrote my article. Once I was done writing my article, I thought to myself, okay, I have what, maybe 6, 7 hours left. I don't really have anything else to do. I could maybe leave the airport, go to a hotel, and maybe, spend the night, get some sleep. Well, here's the thing. I still had to do some prep for that Arizona State Kansas game I was calling the next day. So I literally, by the grace of God and by the grace of chips, cookies, and Pepsi, I was able to stay up through the night because you have to understand the restaurants were closed at that time and just power my way through and work on those Kansas soccer boards throughout the night. And then when I took that flight from Chicago to Denver, I was sleeping throughout. Denver to Phoenix, same thing. I just slept on the plane. Then I went straight from the airport to the game because that's when I got there. I got there at around like I'd say 10 a.m., 10:30 or so. I had to be at the stadium for at around 11 a.m. for call time. Game ends at around 3:34 or so. Go back to my apartment at 4:30, immediately fall asleep, and I get up at 11:30. Slept 7 hours straight. That's how tired I was. And yet I just persevered through. So that was a crazy more than 24 hours in my life, and I think shows one, the balance and all the craziness that I do in this, and me going on the road to cover different things, and sometimes you have to adjust to different ideals when things go wrong, and you have to make sure that you try to be efficient with your time, even if it means you don't end up sleeping. So I think it was an interesting experience. Would I want to have it again? Absolutely not. I mean, it's the reason why I book more nonstop flights right now. Even my mom told me too when I was at the airport. She called me and she said, "You just really have bad luck with these one-stop flights, don't you?" And I said, "Absolutely, I do." So it's a good learning lesson from my standpoint, but again, just a really interesting experience overall. And again, I was back in Cincinnati, loved my time there, but yeah, would not recommend doing that again.
No, no, that's almost a horror story. More power to you for that. I mean, at least you're able to sleep on the plane. I know a lot of people, including myself, who's not really able to sleep on planes very well. So at least you got that in there. But you did bring up the balancing part of all the different things you do, and this is something I blanked on at the beginning. Probably should have asked earlier, but as a student as well, you're taking classes and everything else that comes with a student life. How do you balance that as well as all the different jobs you work?
I think it's just about taking it one step at a time. Even though I'm doing a lot of these different things, I have to still understand that I am a student journalist. And sometimes I tend to lean into that word journalist more than I do student. And my freshman year, it was the other way around. I tended to lean into that word student than I am journalist because I was really focused in my classes. So I have to understand that, hey, I still have to do my work. The one thing I will say about Arizona State that I don't know if is the case with a lot of other colleges, and maybe it's because Arizona State just has a giant student body. There's a lot of online classes you can take. So online classes are not just reserved for people who are taking different degrees or different classes online. Even if you're in person, you can take classes online. So for me, it provides a lot of flexibility in my schedule where, say, if I need to cover or call something during the day, I have a lot of time elsewhere to do my homework at any given time of the day. It also really worked well this past semester because on Mondays and Wednesdays, I had different classes, or rather, it was not a class, it was a professional program with Arizona PBS and Cronkite News where I worked from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day. It was a 9 to 5 job, basically. So I didn't have time to take any in-person classes. And then Tuesday and Thursday, I had to take some other in-person classes. But I was able to, not be overwhelmed because of those online classes here and there. So I think that's one part of it. I think for me personally, I like to just make a list of everything I have to do. And I usually just text it to myself or put it in my notes app and I say, all right, well, okay, tomorrow, number one, write preview for Arizona State basketball against Baylor or something. Two, finish homework for Mediterranean lifestyle. Three, get ready for mass communication law class, right? And just make a list of everything that I have to do. And I mentally block off those times and create a schedule in my head so I don't fall behind, I don't procrastinate, and more importantly, I can stay on track.
Absolutely. I'm a big proponent of the notes app there. So I hear you on that. And, sometimes that's what it takes right there. Just balance everything out, make sure you hit all your steps. And you are going into your senior year, as you mentioned at the top of this. And I think the nice part about this is that we all have things to learn. We all have things that we want to improve on or get to, especially with an upcoming year. I know I do, but I want to ask you going into your senior year, what are some things you're looking forward to or looking to accomplish with this year?
I think for this year, it's putting myself in a good position to get a job. So whether that means networking, obviously that's the biggest thing for me is I'm just not a good networker at heart. So find those connections that I already have right now, talk to them, talk to a lot of people, try to, get in contact with a lot of folks, maybe reach out to them, try to, have some conversations with them or say, "Hey, I'm on LinkedIn right now, found this job. I think it'll be really good for you," or just some itty bitty thing like that. I think that's one thing because I'm just not a networking thing in general. And I think one thing that really helped out with that is taking Rich Hollenberg's break in and break through course, not this year, but this past year, which he kind of laid out a good blueprint on how to contact people and how to create those connections overall. So that's something that I'm going to start implementing more going into my senior year. I think the other thing as well is just starting to be a little bit more crisp with my work. And I'm getting really, really nitpicky with the things that I'm doing wrong that I usually don't get to do as much, because I'm doing other stuff, right? And that's the one thing that's hindered my ability to really critique myself is because I'm doing other stuff, I just don't have the time. So with this extra time that I could potentially have, I look back at a lot of the broadcasts that I do. Usually, whenever I'm on a call, especially for the student radio station, I think to myself, what were my best 5 to 6 minutes? And then I usually listen to that clip. And then I usually look at the good, but I also look at, okay, well, this was not as good as I thought it would be. So I need to do better in this category. I need to do better here. I need to add a little bit more time and score, or just a little bit more establishers about a person and what they're about, describe them a little bit more. So just be a little bit more intentional with that and trying to find what could be the closest to a perfect broadcast in my eyes, with not just, the fundamentals of different ideas of broadcasting or writing or videography, but what's also my voice. And that's another thing I got to figure out because as much as I've liked improving myself, I also improve myself because I'm at Cronkite. So I'm also learning the Cronkite way, but I also have to be a little bit more creative in ways and find my own voice, find my own path. So I try to challenge myself in those types of ways in general to try to find stories that resonate with me and resonate with a lot of people. So I have a little bit more of a connection to those journalistic topics and standards that I can apply to my own voice because I think that's the one thing a lot of employers are looking for. They want somebody who has personality, right? Yes, they want people who will follow the job and can do the job, but they want people who have an identity and that can bring that identity and mesh well with the people that they already have.
Absolutely. Personality is definitely a big thing I've heard as well. I'm a co-host for a like pre-game football show at Iowa called Before the Kickoff. And there's a episode where I put on an old 1960s like helmet and a bunch of people were like, put that in your reel, like you need that because that's what they want to see is the personality. But you started to lean into another thing that I want to ask you about is like you want stories that resonate with you or resonate with people. And I mean, people are looking for stuff and content every single day. Why should they look to student journalism and respect it, maybe even compared to some of the professional outlets that are nearby?
I think the biggest thing I'd say, and this is the case for both hard news and for soft news like sports, people are going to turn to universities for different things. There's a lot of different protests going on, a lot of things going on in the world of news. Sports-wise, a lot that's going on as well because of so many different things, right? So, for example, Arizona State football, 3-9 seasons, past 2 years, right? This past year, everybody cared about it, right? All of a sudden, Sports Center, game day, everybody's trying to interview Kenny Dillingham, Cam Scatterbo, Sam Levitt, all of the people at Arizona State. Who are the first people that were there, though? Who are the first people that saw the change in the Kenny Dillingham era and really did some stories, whether it was at spring football, summer football, or during the season that really told the story of some of these players? It was student journalists. And that's the thing, too, is that a lot of these beat organizations at Arizona State, such as Sun Devil Source, Devil's Digest, House of Sparky, are essentially becoming student run as well because the students are that close to the action. And they're sometimes the leaders in content when it comes to resonating with both the players, the athletic programs, but more importantly, the community in general, right? We tell stories because we can relate to those players at times. We can relate to those athletic programs and really try to put our best foot forward and try to, be there, right? Because there's a lot going on in the city of Phoenix, right? There's 3 other professional sports teams. And yet, we're always going to be at Arizona State sports, right? We're always going to be at football. We're always going to be at men's basketball. Definitely the case with like a lot of smaller sports, which I saw firsthand last year, where I would be the beat reporter for like a women's basketball team or a women's lacrosse team. And I knew a lot of the team just like the back of my mind, or I knew a lot of the coaches. I would ask them questions. And then you'd have like some broadcasters from like the Pac-12 network come in and they're trying to learn the same things that I already knew back at the beginning of the season. So that's the other thing about student journalists. We know, we care about those different things that happen on campus. We care about the things that are happening in the community. And I think more importantly, we're doing this for the most part to benefit ourselves, right? You take a look at the different road trips that I do. Most of them I don't get paid for. That's the case with almost everybody. People don't get paid for this. If anything, maybe they get like a little bit of funding, but we're not making money off of this. We do this because we want to do this for ourselves. We care about the teams we cover, and we want to better ourselves. It's all about the reps, right? So we're going to try to put the reps to the best of our ability, and we're going to care about what we do, right? And that's something you may not see at the local news level, even though they do care about fairness, accuracy, transparency, the other things that we care about. But we're doing this out of the grace of our own heart. We're doing this for the case of willpower, for the case of mentality, and everything that encapsulates the idea of student journalism. I think the one thing that relates back to this idea is my first class, one of my first classes at Arizona State University, where the dean of the school, Batinto Batts, came in. He was talking about accuracy, and he said, "You guys are going to be the ones telling the stories, not in the future, today. You're going to tell those stories now. How are you going to approach the topic? You're going to be the one in charge of those topics and being accurate, being fair, and being transparent because everybody cares about that. And everybody cares about journalism and telling the stories the right way. So that's what I'd say about student journalism is that we care.
I love it. I don't think I know I couldn't. I don't know if anyone else could say it any better than that right there. That was amazing. So I want to say with people that are still entering this, that's the words they hear when they go to Arizona State is that you're the one telling the story, but you've lived some of this now, and now there's more people coming in. They want to be reporters, they want to be broadcasters, they want to be writers. For someone who's starting to get their foot into the door in this industry, what would be your biggest piece of advice for them?
I'd say my biggest piece of advice is find your own opportunity because you're going to get to a place and there's going to be a lot of things going on. You're going to find people who have been doing this for 4 to 5 years. You're going to find people who have won sports Emmys. You're going to find people who are just tuned up for this or knew that this was going to be their job when they were 6 years old. People that came ready for this, right? And you're going to say, okay, well, that's just not me. I don't belong in this industry. Well, that's not true. You do, because otherwise, why would you go to this school? Why would you make the jump to do this in college, wherever you go? But at the end of the day, you need to get better in some way, shape, or form. And I think for myself, I don't get that sort of opportunity without creating my own, whether it was creating a podcast my second semester of freshman year, which was called Buckeye Sports Breakdown. It was about teams in the state of Ohio. And then, of course, we talked about the World Cup stuff too. I realized in that moment, that's where I need to try to create that mentality, right? People are not looking in those moments except for yourself. And that's the one thing you have to do is you have to constantly try to make yourself better over time. And you have to constantly be ready for that one spotlight. And you have to be ready for those moments too. Because we talked about it before. I do a lot of stuff, but I don't do all of those things if it's not for the work that I did my freshman year and the work that I did in high school. So you have to be ready. You have to be able to put your best foot forward. In that regards too, when you go to a place like Arizona State, like Syracuse, even Iowa and others, your journalism career starts the moment you step on campus, your first day of class, whenever you move into your dorm, whatever is that moment that solidifies unto yourself that you are now a college student. You are also a journalist. You are not an aspiring journalist. You are not a student journalist to some extent. You are a journalist. You are telling stories that are going to better the community. And once you get that into your head, you start to say to yourself, how do I become a better journalist, right? A lot of people will say to you, hey, it's your freshman year. Enjoy college. Go out to parties, go out to the games. You don't really have to worry about all of this external stuff until like your sophomore or junior year. That's what a lot of people will say. I know a lot of colleges that I applied to didn't really start journalism classes until that sophomore journalism year, or junior year, I should say. But that's just not the case in a lot of places. You want to start off quick, you want to start off fresh, and you want to be ready for that moment. So I think that's the biggest thing I'd say. Be ready once you get to college because it's going to go by in a flash. And if you just sit around the entirety of your freshman year, you're going to be caught playing catch up like me and a lot of other people out there. So you have to be ready for the moment that's there. So create your own opportunities, find opportunities, continue to be hungry and be ready for that moment.
Absolutely. I mean, it does unfortunately go very fast, but that's exactly what it is. Find as many opportunities as possible. So, last thing for you here, just a chance to plug any of your work or give a shout out to anything that you do, anything for people to take a look at after this.
Well, I think, I mean, there's a lot of shouts that I could do, but I think the biggest thing I could say right now is Ohio Volley Talk as well. So we have our final episode of this season 3 that's going to come out on Friday, I believe the same day that you have this episode coming out. So that's going to be very interesting as well. And feel free to check out all of the other things that I do in the different student clubs at Arizona State University, whether it's Cronkite News, which is the professional program, or Inferno Intel. Blaze Radio might have some stuff on YouTube as well. Just a lot of things that, you can really start to tell what Arizona State athletics is about, what the Cronkite culture is about, a lot of different things overall.
Absolutely. And I'll make sure I link as much as I can. This will be posted on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So it'll have all those links available. That's all I've got for you today. I've taken up enough of your time. I really appreciate it. You've been amazing.
Thank you, Colin. Thanks for having me on.
Well, make sure to check out all of Mihir's work, whether it's from his roots in Cincinnati or now at Arizona State. Sun Devil football is set for another exciting fall. He'll be a great resource for that. And if you want to stay up to date with all upcoming episodes of The Student Beat, make sure to follow me on Twitter at C_Carithers33. We just walked The Student Beat. I'll see you next week for a new episode.